welcome. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is the Later That Same Life 100th episode podcast party. We are live downtown at the famous Montgomery Ballroom, where friends and fans have gathered to help me celebrate. Maybe we'll look back at some of your favorite episodes.
38! Larry! 38!
Okay, 38, Social Contracts. Thank you. Anyway, I also want to thank Lonnie McFadden and the band. They're going to do a full set later. We're going to try and keep the speeches down to a minimum. Oh, and get this, at the end of the night, someone is going to win $350,000.
Nope, no ballroom, just me, alone in a studio, microphone, sound effects. But yes, I am marking this special episode.
Season 8, Chapter 9, Later That Same Life, 100th episode.
I've subtitled this episode, What We've Learned So Far. Little background, in 2020, I began a weekly podcast called I Was 8. I had planned 52 episodes, ended up doing 65, and I received the Canadian Podcast Award for Outstanding Personal Series. I wanted to move on. After all, you can only be 8 for so long. But I did want to continue telling stories. The result was this podcast, Later That Same Life. And not just my stories, but the topics, discussions, and stories from our lives. Of course, always with a personal bent, and meant to engage, entertain, and inform. I want to thank you for all the support these last 2 years. Later That Same Life was nominated for 4 Canadian Podcast Awards, including People's Choice. I went 0 for 4 at the awards this past year, but great to be nominated. Not kidding. I thought for the 100th episode I'd review, reminisce a little, and like I said, see what we've learned so far. I'll randomly begin at episode 7, titled George Carlin. In this story, I was 2 years out of high school, program director of the University FM station run by students. I gave my executive permission to one of our on-air hosts to play George Carlin's 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television, aka the 7 Dirty Words. What I learned, and fairly quickly, that Carlin's bit should have been called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television or Radio. I looked at the title, You Can Never Say them on Television, but hey, this is radio. Not only that, student-run campus FM radio. Come on. I think if radio was in the title of the bit, my decision may have been different. However, I stand by that choice. No regrets. As a matter of fact, getting fired for that decision has become a badge of honor for me in my life. A matter of pride, actually. And getting fired for that forced me to get out into the real world, get a job, and begin my broadcast career. That's what I learned. Episode 7, George Carlin. Episode 8, The Philosopher, is from that same time in my life, and how my university curriculum was heavily loaded with philosophy classes. I mean, I get it, university is not a trade school, but I've often wondered what exactly were all those classes preparing me for? What were they setting me up to do in my life? Answer? Everything I've ever been. Over the last 2 years in this podcast, I've shared a lot of my personal experiences. One with comedian Phyllis Diller, that's episode 28, and Shania Twain, episode 40. My Shania Twain episode is an updated version of that story. Hopefully, I've become a little wiser about that encounter. More recently, episode 96 was entitled Every Celebrity I've Ever Met. There were approximately 60 of them. 60. A list based on my meticulous reconstruction of my career in media. And a couple of days after the podcast was up on all the major platforms and my YouTube channel, I realized I'd forgotten to mention Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, Milli Vanilli, Trisha Yearwood, Winona Judd, Vince Carter, Dennis Hopper. How could you forget Dennis Hopper? Emma Sams, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, and the world's biggest D-bag, Pat O'Brien. Well, much later he did admit to having years of addiction issues, so maybe when I met him it was just the booze talking. Personal stories I have shared on Later That Same Life include a most memorable trip to Las Vegas, my involvement in a race around the world, 8 days, by the way, to circumnavigate the globe, only to finish second by about 20 minutes. Later That Same Life has allowed me to share my struggles with AMD, age-related macular degeneration, an eye disease for which there is treatment but no cure. It's also known to be hereditary. Low vision was something my mom and I both struggled with, and we were able to have many conversations about. Maybe not a favorite topic to share with your mom, but, we did. Speaking of Mom, having this podcast means I was also able to pay tribute to her after her passing this last January at age 94. One of my favorite personal story podcasts was episode 16, The Mona Lisa Swing. I'm not going to retell the whole story here, but go back and find it, episode 16. The lesson learned is that things like the Mona Lisa swing are out there all the time, in my opinion. Our job is to be aware enough to notice them. Later That Same Life has also dealt with many of the issues of our days, always with the goal to inform. The commercialization of space by billionaire space barons, that was episode 11. The threat to democracy, episodes 14 and 18. Foreign interference in our elections. The global supply chain. Inflation. The price of gas. COVID. The war on Ukraine. Roe v. Wade. Disney v. DeSantis. Elon Musk. Twitter. Facebook. The Queen. The monarchy. Classified documents. And even a look, in episode 41, at how the news reports all of this and how we receive and access information in the 21st century. Speaking of our still fairly new century, check out episode 75, 21st Century Lingo. You might be amazed at how much new language you've had to learn in just the last 2 decades. While you're at it, if you haven't before, check out episode 88. It's the latest annual list of banished words. They're only suggestions, of course, but they are words and phrases that are misused or overused to the point of frustration. Banish them, moving forward, because it is what it is, and I'm not gaslighting you. I'm not a big sports guy, as you would know if you caught episode 10 called Sports. But Later That Same Life has looked at soccer twice in context of the World Cup, episode 83, and also through the eyes of Ted Lasso, which was episode 24. P.S. Ted Lasso, like maybe my favorite show ever. Over 99 episodes, this podcast has many times covered social and cultural phenomena, thought leaders, social contracts, critical race theory, woke, great replacement theory, cancel culture, first world problems, sports washing, toxic masculinity, critical thinking, the exhausted majority, artificial intelligence, the 4-day work week, quiet quitting. And by the way, we love to name things, don't we? It's a result of news culture. Every story has to have a nice 2 or 3 word title, a title that looks good on a news graphic. It's part of the dumbing down of the free world. So I just heard this on the heels of quiet quitting, which again is not really quitting your job, just doing the minimum and mentally checking out so that you can still collect a salary. Quiet quitting. But now comes something they've called rage applying. Rage applying. Really? I'm not kidding. I really don't think it's going to catch on, but it's used about people who are so fed up with their current job, they are applying for anything and everything with a vengeance. They just want out. Rage applying. Same report, by the way, said most people who quit, actually quit their job. They don't quit their job or the company. What they really quit is their manager. That's the person with the potential to make their life a living hell. And yeah, that makes sense to me. Later that same life took up the cause of Jennifer Valentine and Lisa LaFlamme. Both had nightmare experiences with their managers, I guess, and their employers. One quit, the other was fired. Doing podcasts on those topics, I didn't think that I would be making a difference, but I also think it's important, where you can, to be an ally. Incidentally, the 2 Christmas specials I've done so far, if you haven't guessed, complete fiction. 100% made up. That in itself was a social comment on the entire holiday. But also it was just fun to do. The other 51 weeks of a year, later that same life deals with reality. So it was just fun to make things up out of thin air. A little seasonal gift to myself. And of course I do hope that my Christmas specials become holiday classics and played every December for generations. Yeah, that's going to happen. If you want to know how to fix the world, Later That Same Life, the podcast episode 45. If you would like to know the key to happiness, Later That Same Life, the podcast episode 92. If you are a regular listener to this podcast, you know that I'm a fan of stats. Numbers can teach us a lot. For example, from different episodes we have learned there are 3.5 million kilometers of pipelines all over the world. Most are for oil and gas. Yet we don't seem to bother to build any, well, very few, that could get precious, necessary for life water from places where there's too much to places where there is not enough. Floods here, droughts there. How do you solve that? Pipelines. Could it be that simple? Americans make up 4% of the world's population, but own over 46% of the world's guns. There are more guns in America than there are Americans in America. If every man, woman, child, and baby in America had one gun, they'd still have about 70 million guns left over. There are about 65 million kilometers of road in the entire world. USA has the most. Canada ranks 7th on the planet. At a decent highway speed, traveling 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take you about 25 years to travel all of the roads on Earth. As of late last year, there are 8 billion people in the world. There are 7.8 billion monkeys, our primate cousins. There's 50 billion individual birds. 9 million people in Canada, which is about 1 in 4, say they have a first language that is neither English nor French. Humans began walking upright about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus. It took almost 1.8 million years before we became Homo sapiens, thinking humans. 1.8 million years. That is a long walk with no ideas. We were walking around for 1.8 million years before we became sapiens. You know, the other day I walked across the street to the grocery store and back, and I thought of like 5 things. Point is, every episode in Later That Same Life is packed with knowledge. And not just knowledge, but knowledge with a capital K. I'm celebrating the 100th episode, but most of the time I call each podcast a chapter. It's more applicable to a book or a story, a turning of the page, life. What is our next chapter? In my next chapter, I might have an episode. As always, I encourage you to share the podcast with anyone and everyone. Broadcasters and podcasters. We live by the numbers. And as for what's coming up on Later That Same Life, well, I guess more of the same, which each week is something different. I'm not live streaming or doing a live radio show where I can tell you what's coming up next. Usually what's coming up is something as current as possible, and who can tell what future events might bring? Well, look at the time. I probably should be getting back to the celebrations at the Montgomery Ballroom. I'd hate to miss my own party. I guess if I have one recurring message I would like to pass along to you, it would be this.
Remember to wash your hands. Remember to wash your hands. Every time you've been around playing with friends, remember to wash your hands. Remember to wash with soap. Remember to wash with soap. When you wash your hands after blowing your nose, remember to wash with soap. And count to 20 at least. Count to 20 at least. Cover your cough and then wash your hands. And always count to 20 at least. Bring it on, sing along to the hand washing song. Remember to clean your nails. Remember to clean your nails every day before you eat your meal. Remember to clean your nails. Remember to wash them all around. Remember to wash them all around. Remember to wash both tops and palms after you've been eating your meal. And count to 20 at least. Count to 20 at least. When you're done going potty, wash your hands and count to 20 at least. Bring it on and sing along to the hand washing song. Let's go!
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.
1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And now your hands are clean. Woo!
Because you said you did a podcast, so I wrote this little song called Mr. Podcast. My name is Larry. What are you going to talk about? Mr. Podcast. You keep us informed. We have good points. Mr. Podcast. And that's it.